Welcome to Kentucky Wide, a podcast production of the Fraser History Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm Sarah Jemerson.
And I'm Mick Sullivan. We are your hosts for this second episode of Kentucky Wide, and this episode focuses on stories from our current exhibition, Love and Marriage, which was graciously sponsored by Davis Jewelers.
Love and Marriage is open now through March 2026 and features some incredible stories, beautiful fashion, important history, and fascinating traditions. We invite you to the museum to experience it with everything else.
Two of the people from the exhibit are the focus of this episode. First, we've got Annie Casey Glover, a dressmaker of international renown.
And then we have a couple who caught our attention in researching the exhibit over the last year, Mabel and Wallace Kelly of Marion County, Kentucky.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy.
And we hope to see you soon. The late 1800s are often referred to as the Gilded Age in America. Coined by author Mark Twain, the term has been used by historians ever since, as it deftly describes the glittering and fancy surface of American society at the time, which, underneath, was filled with political corruption and a struggling lower class. Despite the ugliness that hid in plain sight, when we think about the period, one of the first things that comes to mind is fashion. Fashions change fast in general, and the Gilded Age was no different. The shapes and sizes and cuts of women's dresses changed quickly, so quickly that designers and makers hoping to sell their designs would have to stay up to date or ahead of the curve with each new season. You might assume that fashion centered around major metropolitan centers, and it did. New York and Paris were as important then as they are now. But during the Gilded Age, Louisville clothes were also discussed on both sides of the Atlantic. From New York and San Francisco to England, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. It's important to know that buying clothes in the past wasn't as easy as it is today. Few department stores and no online sales meant keeping a fresh wardrobe was difficult. From the 1890s until World War I, fashionable women from all over the United States traveled to Louisville or else sent orders to have their clothes made. Women from Louisville who had moved away usually made it a point to return for a yearly wardrobe refresh. They knew they could stay fashionable with each new season thanks to the prowess, creativity, and fine handiwork of Louisville's top dressmakers. Many other women from elsewhere, with no ties to the community, observed these Louisville natives and followed suit. There were many dressmakers in town, several of whom are featured in the Fraser History Museum's current exhibition, Davis Jewelers' Love and Marriage. But one specific dressmaker in Louisville found her work in high demand, and she rose above the rest. Annie Casey Glover, better known as Madam Glover. Annie Casey was born in 1861 in County Galway, Ireland, to William and Julia Casey. Her father was a hod carrier. This was a laboring job, assisting bricklayers by mixing mortar and carrying heavy loads of brick to keep the job moving up. It's easy to see why he might have wanted to move up himself. Annie had at least one brother, at least one sister, and many nieces and nephews. Sources from the period differ on her family details, as well as when in her youth she actually arrived in America with her parents. Whenever it might have been, the Caseys were like millions of others. They were immigrants searching for a better life and the chance at prosperity in America. They settled in the Limerick neighborhood of Louisville, Kentucky, a neighborhood just north and west of Old Louisville. Named for County Limerick in Ireland, the neighborhood was home both to recently arriving poor Irish immigrants, as well as more established and well-off Irish families. These were often referred to as the lace curtain Irish, on account of the fancier touches their shotgun homes boasted. Annie Casey and her family would not have been considered lace curtain, but the frilly fancy fabric would factor into her life soon enough. That journey began in 1879 when her father William died, because it meant that the teenager would have to find work to help the family. In 1880, the young Annie was listed in the Louisville City Directory as a seamstress. Like thousands of other young women around the country, she used needle and thread, and sometimes the power of new sewing machines, to to earn money making dresses and other articles of clothing for other women to buy. The vast majority of women working in the field would never rise far in the workplace. The wages were meager, the work was hard, and there were limitations on what work women could even do. Annie Casey, however, was an exception to the rule. While working for Sharp & Middleton's New York store here in Louisville, later known as Stewart Dry Goods, she became very well known for designing wedding trousseau. So, what exactly is a trousseau? Simply put, it's a collection of personal belongings a bride-to-be gathers before her wedding. Society had expectations for the lives of young married women, and a trousseau was a collection of outerwear and underwear that would keep her properly dressed for the role she was expected to fill. During the late 19th century into the 20th, it was customary for women to have a trousseau to bring with them when they married. Upper-class ladies put together extravagant, expensive trousseau filled with gowns, lace, and corsetry. But the trousseau was a tradition in which even middle-class women and those of modest means participated. Young women would begin to fill their hope chest with family heirlooms, household items, and personal belongings in preparation for the wedding trousseau. Annie was a pioneer in selling a bundled trousseau, removing the headache and expense of acquiring all of the necessities individually. It was a one-stop shop, and it saved women money to boot. Of course, wedding bells would ring for her, too. On the night of June 3, 1886, Annie Casey got married in Louisville to Mr. Walter E. Glover.
Miss Casey has been for the past 3 years connected with the dressmaking department of Sharp & Middleton and has, by her pluck and industry, made a signal success of her business.
The following day's Courier-Journal reported,
She has probably made more trousseau in the last 2 or 3 years than any dressmaker in town, and the stylish street costume which did duty at her own wedding bore testimony to the taste and the skill that have won one of the best positions of the kind in the city.
Perhaps it was fashion, perhaps it was something else, but Annie was a bit of a Francophile. Her interest in French culture extended beyond haute couture and is reflected even in the names she gave her children. The couple had 2 daughters, Marie and Antoinette Glover. Together, the family lived in a beautiful home on Cherokee Road. Walter was in the insurance and hotel businesses, and, as you might imagine, he soon became known as one of the best-dressed men in the city of Louisville. It is unknown whether he was Irish or even a native Louisvillian, but in terms of his career, managing the money side of his wife's dressmaking business soon became one of his top responsibilities. This arrangement suited Madame Glover, as she was now free to design while her husband handled the business affairs and bookkeeping. In 1891, she opened the first Madame Glover dress shop on South 4th Street in Louisville. By 1904, she operated a larger shop in the Tyler Building on Jefferson Street. During this period, Madame Glover quickly became the most sought-after dressmaker in turn-of-the-century Louisville. She was an artist dressmaker who traveled to Paris every year for inspiration from the original source. She saw the showings at the great houses, identifying the most beautiful and best quality fabrics. She bought the most expensive buttons, the loveliest laces, the silkiest braid. Every detail was of enormous importance. That was the way she assembled her materials, and that is the way she made her clothes, directing a sewing room in which about 100 girls and women worked. Debutantes and brides from far and wide, even visitors here for the Kentucky Derby, wanted a Madame Glover original. It was well known that her ever-changing and beautiful creations were influenced by her regular trips to Paris to study the latest European trends and techniques. The upper class of Louisville could take its place alongside the high societies of larger cities, thanks to Madame Glover, who rose above her own class barriers. One can only imagine that her journey from a working-class daughter of immigrants to an admired authority in fashion was neither easy nor expected. Madame Glover's life and career is an example of what can happen when talent and hard work combine under the right circumstances of opportunity. She experienced the American dream much more than many women of her era and background could hope for. She must have known this, too, because she employed many women from the Limerick neighborhood in her shop. Madam Glover operated her store in Louisville for nearly 3 decades until her husband passed away in 1912. She retired thereafter and lived another 35 years in New York City. She died in 1947 and was buried in Louisville's Cave Hill Cemetery. The April 22, 1947 Courier-Journal paid homage to the late Madam Glover with a touching article. The article locates the spirit of this tastemaker, an Ireland-born, Paris-traveling Kentucky resident, in her personality.
Nothing could have been more Irish than this bright-eyed little native of Galway, it reads. Yet her taste was in accord not with Dublin but with Paris, the strange harmony of French and Irish temperaments often noted in history since Gaelic culture of the Middle Ages fled to the refuge of monasteries in Ireland, found expression in her personality. A woman who created so much beauty also created happiness. She belonged to an era, and her like will not be seen again. As a very old lady of 88, she passed on to another realm, and one cannot but wonder if the angels who greet her will sing with a French accent or an Irish brogue.
Imagine living the life of a young woman in the 1930s. You were fortunate and you have a fulfilling career that you love: teaching. Teaching was a common career option for women of the era, and you feel lucky to enjoy your work. But then you meet a handsome young man, fall in love, and say yes when he proposes marriage. Of course, it's the middle of the Great Depression in America, and times are hard. Still, you find a way to have a simple yet beautiful wedding ceremony. A new dress is too extravagant of a purchase, so on the big day, you wear your best brown wool suit, while family and friends help by sharing some of their rations so that you can bake a wedding cake. You'll never forget your special day, but then reality sets in. Because of the Depression, there are new regulations prohibiting 2 people from the same family from each having a job. Only a husband or a wife are allowed to work. Of course, as a woman, your husband's career is seen as more important than yours, so regrettably, you quit your job. This was a possible reality for Kentuckian Mabel Kelly and countless other women during the Great Depression. Marriage bars, as they were known, kept these married women from having jobs in many private companies as well as in state and federal government. During the economic turmoil of the Great Depression, there just weren't many good-paying jobs, so prohibiting married women from working was a way to preserve available jobs for others, men who may or may not be providing for a family, or unmarried women who had no one else to support them. Of course, a woman's wages were far below those of men. Married women working at the time were often seen as only working for pin money, an unkind description for small amounts of money that might be used to purchase hat pins or other fancy non-essentials. None of this was new. The first marriage bars occurred as early as the 1880s. Prior to the Great Depression, 9 states had marriage bar laws, and by 1940, 26 states had passed them. In 1932, a marriage bar became federal law. Part of the Economy Act of 1932 was a requirement that if a husband and wife both worked for the federal government, one of them must give up their employment. And since women usually made less money, they were typically the ones left jobless. As a result of all of this, some women began to marry in secret to avoid losing their jobs. One of the biggest supporters of marriage bars was a woman named Frances Perkins. In 1911, 1 year after earning her master's degree in political science from Columbia University, Perkins witnessed the infamous and tragic Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. This horrific event, which caused 146 deaths, 123 being women and girls, influenced Perkins' career and inspired her to fight for workers' rights, especially women. Perkins went on to become the first female member of a presidential cabinet when Roosevelt appointed her as Secretary of Labor, a post that she held for his entire tenure as president. Perkins was instrumental in developing many New Deal programs, including Social Security and the Civilian Conservation Corps. And Perkins believed marriage bars protected single working women.
The woman pin money worker who competes with the necessity worker is a menace to society, a selfish, short-sighted creature who ought to be ashamed of herself. Until we have every woman in this community earning a living wage, I am not willing to encourage those who are under no economic necessities to compete with their charm and education, their superior advantages, against the working girl who has only her two hands.
Of course, much of this was forced to change by the time the United States entered World War II. With so many men heading to the battlefronts overseas, women were needed to replace them in the workforce. However, marriage bars were not explicitly illegal in the United States until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And they had a profound effect on young women, much like Mabel Graham. Born in Lebanon, Kentucky in 1904, Mabel took her education seriously, ultimately earning a degree at the University of Kentucky in 1927. After graduation, Mabel taught English and science at Lebanon High School, while also nurturing her artistic side. Photography excited her, and while she may have been modest about her skills, a national award proved that Mabel had a talent for the art. It began with a portrait she snapped of her neighbor, 3-year-old Mary Margaret O'Daniel. Not expecting to win, she submitted her picture to the Courier-Journal as part of the first ever Kodak Newspaper National Snapshot Awards. To her surprise, she won, which meant her picture would be sent on to the national competition. Overall, the contest had over 250,000 entries, and when the grand prize winner was chosen in 1935, it was none other than Mabel Graham. The victory earned her over $1,500 in prize money, which was quite a sum at the time, considering it was the midst of the Great Depression. By the time she was a prize-winning photographer, Mabel was engaged to Wallace Kelly, someone she had known her entire life. Both of their families had been in Lebanon since Kentucky's colonial period. Both were members of the Lebanon Presbyterian Church, and both had attended Centre College. After graduating from Centre, Wallace attended the Cincinnati Art Academy, where he found a love for illustration. This led him to New York City in 1929, hoping to begin a career in book illustration. But it was ill-timed. After the crash of the stock market and the beginning of the Great Depression, Wallace received only one commission. So when his father died in 1932, Wallace returned home to Kentucky. His father had owned the local newspaper, the Lebanon Enterprise, which his family would need help running. His brother took over management, and Wallace worked as a linotype operator. Wallace had actually dated Mabel's younger sister, Polly, but when he began work on a book about a school teacher, he grew curious about Mabel's first-hand experience on the job. Their conversations deepened, and the couple collaborated to create their own fictional world. These artistic collaborations led to a collaboration in life as well. Love developed, and thanks to her photo prize money, Wallace and Mabel were married on Valentine's Day in 1936. They held a small ceremony at her parents' house. Very few were in attendance, only immediate family members. The best man was his brother Oliver, who had taken over the newspaper, and the maid of honor was Mabel's sister Polly, so clearly there were no hard feelings. A published wedding announcement described her bridal outfit as a toast-colored semi-sheer wool suit trimmed in fox fur, with which she will wear a brown gross-grain tricorn hat and other brown accessories. This very outfit, the one that Mabel wore on her wedding day, is in the permanent collection at the Fraser History Museum, and is part of the exhibition Davis Jewelers Love and Marriage, which runs through March 2026. Of course, marriage meant the end of Mabel's teaching career. A week after the wedding, she was replaced at the high school by an unmarried woman from Danville, Kentucky. Mabel and Wallace took their honeymoon in New York City, where they participated in a 6-week course on portrait photography. Marriage bars might apply to teaching, but they did not apply to entrepreneurs. So when they returned from the big city, they put their new skills to use and opened a photography studio in Lebanon. Back in New York City, Mabel and Wallace had earned critical praise for their photographs. Back home in Lebanon, it seems that their artistic style wasn't as appreciated. The couple struggled to make ends meet during the remainder of the Great Depression, and by 1940, Mabel and Wallace decided to sell the business. But there was another, more positive reason. Mabel wasn't the only national prize winner of the pair. Eager to get back to writing, Wallace applied for and won the first ever Alfred A. Knopf Fellowship in Fiction for 1940. This awarded Wallace $100 a month for 1 year so that he could devote his time to completing a novel. It would be the second example of poor timing for Wallace. Unfortunately, his book, Days Are as Grass, was released just a week after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Initially projected to be one of the year's best sellers, he found that the American public didn't have much hunger for new novels in their first days of World War II. Book sales were poor, and Wallace was drafted into the United States Army to serve as a medical technician in New Guinea. Ever the artist, Wallace sketched scenes of his daily life with any available materials. He even made small wood carvings, all of which he sent home to Mabel. After returning, Mabel and Wallace welcomed their daughter, Martha, into the world in 1947. Not long after, Mabel told news reporters that photography had taken a backseat to the demands of raising a young family. However, Wallace continued his artistic pursuits. He wrote poems and magazine articles, and in the 1950s, he redevoted himself to visual art. Wallace made work in many formats, including photography, filmmaking, painting, drawing, and printmaking. Mabel and Wallace not only lived an artistic life, but an adventurous one as well. In 1940, Mabel, Wallace, and family and friends set out on a road trip to see the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone National Park. As part of our permanent collection, in addition to Mabel's wedding outfit, we have a pair of men's hiking pants that she wore in the early decades of the 1900s. It seems Martha supported Wallace's artistic endeavors, and the couple collaborated until Wallace's death in 1988, when Martha found that Wallace had passed away at his drawing table. In an article in the Lebanon Enterprise from 1992, Martha recalled,
"We were very close. Sadly, being left alone, I see we were too close for either of us to have ever functioned as a whole person after the other one was gone."
Mabel passed away in their home on February 12, 1994. The life they built will forever be preserved in one of Wallace's most important artistic pieces, a short, silent film he created that documented daily life for the family. The film features Wallace, Mabel, brother Oliver, mother Mattie, and the family dog, Miss Lady Luck, at their home in Lebanon, Kentucky. Entitled Our Day, viewers see the family members in everyday activities such as playing the piano, croquet, gardening, knitting, and cooking. The film is considered important because it contrasts with the stereotypical depictions of rural Southerners in the Great Depression. But it's also really good. The shots are creative, the pacing is engaging, and there's quite a bit of humor built into the clearly crafted silent narrative. As such, in 2007, Our Day was selected for the National Film Registry by the Librarian of Congress, deeming the film culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. You can find a link to it in our show notes.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Kentucky Wide.
This episode was written by our colleagues Simon Miners and Amanda Breedy.
It was produced by Mick Sullivan with music from Mick Sullivan and Kent Clarer.
You also heard the voice of Abby Flanders.
Make sure to subscribe or follow so you can join us in a few weeks for an episode featuring momentous court cases in the lives of a pair of Kentucky women.
And as always, we invite you to come see us at the Fraser History Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm Mick.
And I'm Sarah.
And this has been Kentucky Wide,
a production of the Fraser History Museum.